Hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, Liv. And again today, I'm here. I wanted to finish off what I started doing last week by revisiting that third episode of the podcast, all about the shitty behavior of Zeus, because I didn't even get through it all, but I also just found commenting on that earlier episode that I'd done to just be so interesting. Like it was a really unexpectedly great episode to use to examine one. Like, I mean, I've learned so many things since the beginning of this podcast, but specifically, I am just currently so obsessed with these ideas of like what existed before the patriarchy and how can we kind of see ripples of it in stories of the post-patriarchal mythos of things like Zeus and everything. So we are doing that again today. But before I get into that, I have a couple of things to announce. So we are now towards the end of June in 2024, which is so wild and also means that the podcast is now 7 years old. I mentioned that last week. So it's not new information, but a reminder that next week I am going to be doing this summer's Q&A episodes. It's only twice a year that I do these Q&A episodes, so get your questions in. If you missed the deadline, which is going to be just like a handful of days before Tuesday's episode, this is me figuring it out on the fly. Ask your questions before Friday, the end of Friday, July 26th, so that I can answer them. But I love to hear from all of you. I've already gotten so many great questions in, but just remember, this is your opportunity to ask about characters that you may be sort of perpetually wondering, like, why I don't talk about them. Like, so often, you know, I have people who want episodes on characters like, say, Nyx, Knight, or Nike, Nikki, Victory. Like, if you have these characters that you're particularly interested in, that you heard about and you want to know more, this is your opportunity to prompt me. Tell me those characters that you want to know more about, and I will tell you everything I can. Because most of the time, the reason why I haven't done an episode on those particular characters is purely because there is not enough surviving content of storytelling to tell you about them. That is so common with characters like, say, Nyx and Nikki, Nike, because both of those characters are, they conceptualize things, right? They are goddesses of concepts, of like really important earthly concepts, like the night or the very concept of victory as a thing. And so more often than not, they don't have stories attached to them. So it's not easy for me to do like a storytelling episode telling you what's going on. But it is the perfect opportunity for these Q&A episodes because it means I can answer you specifically and then also just like tell you everything I can possibly share about those characters. So get your questions in. It's mythsbaby.com/questions. Get them in before Friday. Please don't email them to me. Use the form on mythsbaby.com/questions. It all feeds into a Google Sheet so that I can just answer the questions all from one place. It's really the only way I can manage to get to as many questions as possible because I'm not like bouncing around between all these different platforms of like where there are questions. I will never remember. So use that form, mythsbaby.com/questions. And beyond that, in the coming weeks, I'm still figuring out exactly when, I'm going to be having a few different pieces of big news to share. So firstly, I have been working with an illustrator who Michaela found, and I'm just going to tease it now. I'll talk about her more and more. If you've been paying attention on my Instagram, you might already have an idea. But I have been working with an illustrator to create a brand new logo along with a number of pieces of new and really good merch for the show. I am truly so excited to finally have like really, really fun merch, you know, and hopefully stuff that people really want. And I know my merch has been like really old and really like dated for literally ever because it's just always so much extra work that I just never have the time for, but I'm pushing it this time, and oh my god, these illustrations are so worth it. So stay tuned. We have merch coming with this brand new logo, which is utterly stunning. We are going to have the Oracle, the Pythia, pronouncing prophecies from her tripod. There is Euripides merch and Persephone and the Underworld merch and Medusa merch. Incredible designs from this illustrator, so stay tuned. Make sure you're checking my Instagram for that, because obviously it's pretty damn visual, so that'll be the primary place that I'm sharing this stuff with you all, but I will be talking about it on the show as well. So we have all of that coming, and that is going to line up with a big series that Michaela and I are doing on Euripides, the man, the myth, the legend. My kingdom for a time machine, the way that I would go back in time and talk to Euripides, the things I would ask him, the conversations we would have. And because we cannot, we are doing this entire series on him. So we're going to be looking at some of his plays, but mostly him as a person and kind of like what made his work so unique in the ancient world, so unique now, what kind of made him particularly interesting. Really anything I can tease out. I have so many books on Euripides, so we've just been pulling stuff from that, and we're getting some incredible guests lined up, including guys, this is a really big deal for me. We're getting a professor from my undergrad who was my favorite classics professor, who I've talked about on the show before, but when I was doing my degree in classics, I participated in 2 like radio shows of Greek tragedies, and yes, they were both plays by Euripides because this professor has great taste, and yes, I once played Electra, and then the following year he made it much more professional and had like actual theater students playing the main roles, but then I was in the chorus, and that was pretty great too, and I will be speaking with this professor about Euripides. It's a really big deal for my just ego, I guess. Anyway, that's coming soon. So much Euripides. I'm clearly way too excited about it. So between that, new merch, and of course, we're going to be doing another group trip to Greece. I don't remember if I mentioned this on last week's episode, but I'm doing it now. It was so much fun. It was so great. Michaela and I are going to be recording a little bit of bonus content for you all where we just kind of chat about how it went, how much fun we had, what we did. We're going to be talking about the future projects when it comes to these trips. I am working on 2 different trips for next year. I'm hoping to have 2 different kind of price ranges. Both will include a lot of ancient sites, but one, the equivalent of the one we had this year, goes to a lot more cities. You get to go to an island. You get to go just sort of further into Greece and experience more of that. And then, because I really want to have more affordable stuff for you all, for the people who can't afford that or who might be just interested in the different locations, we're also going to be having a slightly shorter trip where we have a home base in Athens the whole time, and then we're going to be seeing sites in the vicinity. So they're going to have some crossover sites, but a lot of like really unique ones between the 2 trips. So they both kind of have a lot to offer. They're both going to be able to take 12 people. So that will mean 24 of you amazing listeners will be able to go with me and Michaela to Greece next year. And it was really so much fun. So stay tuned for more about that. We've got, honestly, like 7 years in, I feel like I'm finally getting my shit together with the help of Michaela. And we've got a lot coming. So really excited. But today we are finishing Zeus, but really just me looking at this very early episode of the podcast, the 3rd episode of the podcast ever. I'm realizing actually that probably this is coming out like a good 7 years, almost to the day from that episode. Oh my God, that's way more fun. And so we're looking at the rest of that Zeus episode that I didn't get to last week, and really looking at the ways that this kind of content, back when I first talked about these stories and these characters, like I was looking at them purely from the story perspective, right? Purely as kind of a short story or equivalent, something that really is just sort of a narrative. And now, I have all this knowledge about everything that went into that and what might be living under the surface, what might be lost, what might be coming from an earlier prehistoric, before we had written sources world where turns out they worshipped women more than men. So what are we seeing left over? I'm already getting too excited. Let's get into it. This is episode 267, Remnants of a Matriarchy Hidden in the Crimes of Zeus, Part 2. Before we get into the sections that I didn't get to cover last week, I want to remind you of where we left off, because I have some things to say about Hera.
But our story isn't done yet. With Argus now disposed of, and Hera horribly depressed about it, Zeus, good husband that he is, not actually, frees Io. But Hera, totally pissed, sends a gadfly to just follow Io around forever, just continually stinging her, just always. Because at this point, the poor woman is still a cow. Eventually, Io is turned back into a woman, thank God, and of course, Zeus learns no lessons, and he still can't keep his hands off of her, and they end up having a couple of kids. The moral of the story here is, there have always been awful men in this world, and there have always been women who will blame the victim. Honestly, Hera, why didn't you just turn Zeus into a cow and then have him continually stung?
At the risk of, seeming like I want to, rewrite the entirety of Greek mythology, because I think you all know that I don't, I'm so interested in the idea of where Hera comes from, because Hera, of all the goddesses, is, well, she's an agent of the patriarchy, right? She is so beholden to Zeus that she serves as this punisher of the women that he, either assaults or just, cheats on her with. And it's always about Hera punishing the women. And I think that what that often serves as, she has these much older forms, and she as a character is so much more ancient than the idea of a woman punishing another woman for the things her husband does, right? Hera as a goddess is so much bigger than that. I want to say that first. She is so much bigger, but you can see that this part of her, that little aspect, as being a kind of, cautionary tale, right? Like as if it's being used by the patriarchy as a collective. It's being used to remind other women, to be beholden to their husbands. And that's not coming, entirely from just this misogynist point of view, or this idea that women can't have freedom or can't be on their own. It's not, it obviously has elements of that, and it became that. But from its most, ancient origins, from its, say, the purest form, before, the origins of something like this is coming out of this fear over paternity, fear over women or people with uteruses having the ability to control life. Humans aren't parthenogenic. They can't create a baby all on their own, but women hold the power, right? Women have the control over the actual creation. They are the ones who can, hide the paternity. And I say hide intentionally because that is clearly the fear that is being expressed through these instances of Hera's character, right? When Hera does stuff like punish Io for being with Zeus, or punish Semele for being with Zeus, or any number of other women who Zeus was with. When she's doing that, she's not just, exemplifying this idea of women blaming other women for the men. Like, she's not just exemplifying, like, the stereotype. The stereotype came from somewhere, and it came from the idea that the women are the bigger threat because the women control the conception in a way that the men cannot. The women, and again, I'm using men and women very broadly. I want to make clear I'm referring to the people who have the power to create the life inside of them, whoever they may be. But broadly, in the ancient world, they're talking women. And so, we're looking at this aspect of, like, the fear that comes with that, right? Like, the men are trying to create this power structure where they are the most important, where they control things, but they have to deal with the fact that there is one thing that they cannot have complete control over. They cannot have complete control over who is the father of a woman's child. They can't. And so they create these kinds of stories to deter these, mishaps, whatever, right? Like, they're worried that a woman is going to go and have the baby of another man. And so in order to, like, make that seem like a really bad thing, a really dangerous thing that women should avoid, they develop these stories of Hera doing exactly that, punishing women for being with her husband. But it's not about the cheating, right? I mean, it became about the cheating, but ultimately the origins of it are the other woman that Zeus is with creates life from Zeus and therefore is threatening to the patriarchal order. And so we get these notions of the women having to be punished because they, are this threat. I feel like I'm just kind of going in circles, but I'm just so obsessed with the idea. And so I just want to really clarify when we're talking about Hera and the concepts like that ultimately it is not coming from just this, like, catty mentality. Like, the idea that women are catty like that women are jealous like that, all of that comes from the origins of this male fear over whether or not the women in their lives are having their children or someone else's, because they'll never be able to be certain. I'm obsessed.
Europa is the daughter of a Phoenician king. Phoenicia at this time was a civilization on the Mediterranean coast of the Middle East, like Lebanon, Syria, Israel kind of area.
I'm going to talk a lot more, but I have to break into this moment here because it's really clear to me that in researching this episode, again, 7 years ago, at that time, I was doing really, really minimal research. This was just a silly hobby I was doing for fun. And so I'm certain I used a Wikipedia page. I'm certain I read the propaganda, and that's why I used that word, the name of the place, when I would call it Palestine now, because in the ancient world, guess what? It was called Palestine. And did it have other names too? Yep, probably. But guess what? In the ancient Greek world, we know for a fact that Herodotus, the first historian in recorded human history, called it Palestine. In any case, the funny thing I have to tell you with that little moment is that I recently got a 1-star review from somebody who listened to an episode, this third episode of the podcast. They listened to an episode from 7 years ago, heard me say the name for that, the modern illegal country. And they decided to give me 1 star and assume that I was on that country's side. Because sometimes people don't understand that time is linear and that people grow and change. And I just really wanted to, like, reply and scream at that person that in 2021 I lost fucking friends and listeners for saying something. So maybe listening to something from 7 years ago isn't a fair assumption as to my politics now.
It doesn't actually matter, but it's a bit of ancient history. So Europa, she's another mortal that Zeus just can't keep his bloody hands off of. She's young though, like a teenager, so extra gross. Obviously that doesn't matter to Zeus. He decides he wants her, and his solution in this case is just straight up abduction. But there's a trick. Zeus can't show himself to Europa. We know this already. I'm not clear how this applies to Io. You can just push that out of the way. She never blew up. Continuity isn't always a thing in Greek mythology. What can I say? In the case of Europa, Zeus cannot show himself to her. So since he can't just roll up all white-bearded and holding a thunderbolt, instead he transforms himself into a white bull. An obvious way to seduce a woman if I've ever heard one. So his bull self strolls up to where Europa and her friends are hanging out by the sea, and basically he just pulls the cute animal card. He strolls up, acts all tame and social, and Europa totally takes the bait. She's all over this bull, petting it and fawning over it. She's talking baby talk, the whole shebang. She has no idea it's actually a creepy old man trying to rape her. Eventually, she climbs right up onto his back. Zeus takes this opportunity and he leaps out into the sea and just starts swimming. Europa can't get away. I think we have to assume she can't swim, so she's basically just holding on while this mystery bull carries her off into the ocean. Totally normal. No reason to panic. Zeus takes Europa to Crete, where he almost certainly rapes her, but she also becomes queen, so silver lining, I guess? Not really. Her brother, Cadmus, of the Cadmus and Harmonia I mentioned earlier, he ultimately goes on quite the quest to help find his beloved sister. Basically, Europa never makes it home. She stays as queen of Crete, and she and Zeus have a slew of kids, including the famous Minos, who becomes king and plays quite the role in future myths of the bull variety. Because of this Europa-Zeus origin story of Crete, the people there really had a thing for bulls, to say the least.
So, Europa is obviously an absolutely fascinating character, not least because she comes from mythological Phoenicia, generally the area of the ancient Canaanite people. You know? The people that have been in that little stretch of land, like between Syria and Egypt for 3,000, 4,000 years. Yeah, anyway, she comes from that area, and her story is of course all about bringing essentially culture to ancient Greece, right? So she is the perfect story to like slot in so soon after my series on the Bronze Age, because Europa is this really fascinating example of a character whose story was developed and sort of eventually, however it may happen, like placed into Greek mythology in order to understand a lot of things that happened historically. So the ancient Greeks attributed the Greek alphabet, which of course then went on to spawn the Latin alphabet and everything around that. Like, they attribute the creation, the invention of the Greek alphabet to the Phoenician people, these people of Canaan, in the area of Lebanon, Palestine, that sort of area in the Levant is where is where the alphabet came from. I have so much trouble with all of this right now, obviously with the region, because the number of times I've now been told that I am rewriting history when I read Herodotus, the world's first recorded historian in human history, and how he called that bit of land Palestine. Anyway, so that is where Europa is coming from. You know, the city that ancient Tyre is technically in modern Lebanon. It's like right on the border of what should be Palestine, and it's such an interesting thing that this story, you know, establishes her as being brought from there to Crete, because what that is doing, obviously, from the very basic standpoint, like her name goes on to lend the name to Europe, right? Like that's where we get the word Europe, is from this story of Europa coming from that area. Because go ahead and look at a map of the collapse of the Bronze Age. Typically it has this little area called Gaza. And generally that is, it's close to where Europa is coming from that like 4,000 years ago. We're talking, let's say maybe 3,500 years ago. That's where this timing is coming from. Her story is this cultural memory of the Bronze Age and of the way the Mediterranean was so full of life and connection, the way they shared everything, between all of these ancient places, the way they shared culture and history and language, alphabets. Europa as a myth is exemplifying that connectivity of the ancient Bronze Age and just how widespread it was and just how much the ancient Greeks thanked it for the creation of like everything we know from archaic, classical, everything of ancient Greece. And so having Zeus bring Europa, like, of course, yes, from a story standpoint, it's icky. But from a historical standpoint, what it's telling is this idea of a Greek god, Zeus, going to this place where they had culture, where they had this alphabet, going to this place and taking the culture to Crete. And as far as I can gather and take a very educated and slightly obvious guess, the bull aspect is not so much about Zeus like needing to disguise himself as a bull as it is about a way to understand the existing bull iconography of Crete, right? Like ancient Crete, the Minoan civilization of the Bronze Age, were an incredibly mysterious people, even to the people of later ancient Greece, this archaic classical period when these stories are getting developed and fleshed out and told and retold. The Minoan culture was still an incredible mystery because Linear A, the language that they had, it's not close enough to Linear B, for them to have really easily understood it even by that later period, let alone for us now. And so they would be working with what we are working with, which is that you go to Knossos and you're like, there are so many bulls here. These people loved bulls. And so based on this idea that they understood that a large part of their culture, was inspired by the people of Phoenicia and their alphabet, they attribute the alphabet to Cadmus, Europa's brother, but the concept remains the same. They are taking these pieces of cultural inspiration that they knew came from that area in the ancient Levant, and they are putting it into a story that, both explains how Greece got all of this stuff, but also gives a lot of credit to Zeus, right? Like it's a way of like cementing Zeus into this story, establishing Europa as this, she went on to found like a Greek dynasty, the Minoan people, and so on. And so it's this way of connecting these things that, by the time these stories are being developed, they'd lost that cultural history, like we talked about in the Bronze Age. They'd lost that cultural history of understanding how all that happened, but they understood enough to know, it's coming from those people to the south. It's coming from, this sort of the bull iconography is all there, and so we slot it all into one story that explains so many things. But of course, also very importantly, what it's doing is explaining also the importance of women on Crete, because in the Minoan culture, again, we don't have writing until the period when the Mycenaeans are in there. And so we know they've made, they could have made too many changes for us to fully understand what the Minoans would have been like before the Mycenaean contact or before the major Mycenaean contact. What we know is that goddesses were incredibly important. We know that they primarily seem to have worshipped women. There is really minimal minimal content, like art and things like that suggest men played a particularly important role. Like, it's really all priestesses, it's all goddesses, it's a lot of mother goddess worship. And so they had to bring a woman to Crete from that area in order to establish that and have it like actually work, right? Like, the reason why myths are so interesting and so timeless aren't because they're entertaining stories, but because they explain so much about human history through an entertaining story. It's the same reason why Ariadne is incredibly important in mythological, history that comes from that region later, and that's because they saw all of these women, the volume of images of priestesses and women just having these really important roles. They then have to develop stories that work within that explain that. And I say develop stories, I want to be clear, like, they're not doing this intentionally. They're not like sitting down and being like, well, we have to explain this, right? Like, this is coming out of centuries of people just sharing stories and history with each other, and eventually, at some point it became a tangible story that got passed down to us. But they're not intentionally coming up with this mythos. It's just happening naturally based on what they do and don't know about the regions. It's fucking fascinating. And already, my God, I could go on forever. Thank God I split this into 2 episodes.
Number 4, Aegina. Speaking of eagles, Zeus also appeared as an eagle to abduct Aegina, also a nymph. Her father pursues Zeus, trying to get her back. It's pretty sad this is such a rare response as to be actually heartwarming. People almost never try to save the women that Zeus just takes off with. But Zeus won't let a pesky father deter him from his goals. He rapes Aegina on an island, and he throws his thunderbolts at her father, forcing him to give up and return home. The island, though, then takes her name, but Hera, in all her misplaced anger, sends a plague.
I have cut at least one character of more minor characters that were covered in that episode, simply because there are just so many and I don't have a lot of insights into a lot of the more minor characters that Zeus does horrible things with, and that's just because it tends to be that they all kind of represent really similar things, just in different regions. So really similar to the stuff I've already talked about, but just, regional differences. They would often have like a regional woman that was like assaulted by Zeus or kidnapped or whatever. Like, it's, it's like a Heracles thing, only darker and weird. But I did keep Aegina because I find that one to be interesting. I wish I knew more historically, but on the group trip that we just did last month, we did go to the island of Aegina, which is an island. It's just in the Saronic Gulf. So it's really close to Athens. And that's why I selected it, so that everyone got a taste of a Greek island without us having to go very far. But selling how awesome the group trip was aside, Aegina is really interesting because it's a very small island, but it is so close to both Attica, so Athens, and the Argolid, so Mycenae and Argos, in terms of ancient cities. It's right in between them both. It's an island right in that water that literally separates those two areas. And so it was incredibly important from a strategic ancient time period thing, and I know that I wish I remembered more, but our tour guide, who is the most wonderful fucking woman in the whole world, and we are doing everything we can to ensure that she is the tour guide for the future tours, because oh my God, she was such a gem. But she was talking to us a little bit about ancient Aegina and kind of the issues that they had with Athens, and I think they there was a lot of infighting and stuff, and so I think that this plague story that I mentioned in this earliest episode is kind of coming from that. It's probably coming from an Athenian perspective and essentially suggesting that island was plagued, which is just kind of a fun and silly historical thing. But that island, from another historical perspective, is just particularly unique in a lot of different ways. It has this temple to a goddess / nymph who we know almost nothing about. It's the only temple we know of to her, and it's still in pretty good condition. And Aegina is just a generally really interesting island. Also, in modern times, it is almost entirely pistachios. They're so good. I call it Pistachio Island. That's irrelevant. But a fun fact about that island.
Ganymede. Once more with feeling, Zeus transforms himself into an eagle and visits, this time, a boy named Ganymede. He's just minding his own business, tending to his flock of sheep. Zeus abducts Ganymede and brings him up to Mount Olympus to be both his cupbearer and a virtual sex slave. Zeus is an equal opportunities abductor, which is kind of nice, but if you look at the details, Zeus does way more awful things to women. Like, he abducts this boy, but then he takes him up to Mount Olympus. Like, you basically just took them up to the kingdom of the gods. Like, he has to be your cupbearer and, I mean, your sex slave. That's not great. But basically, I mean, let's just compare it. The one guy that Zeus abducts, and he gets pretty golden treatment by comparison. He also gives Ganymede's father some horses in return for, you know, abducting his son and basically holding him hostage for the rest of his life. Whatever.
Now, Ganymede is such an interesting character. Like, I do want to first say, you know, based on the way I told that story, I've gotten people rightfully annoyed with how I handled the one story of a man getting abducted and assaulted by Zeus. And I agree, like, I didn't handle it, you know, particularly sensitively. However, I still think ultimately, like, the point I was making very poorly still stands. Like, it is horrific, absolutely. But it is really notable that there is, you know, there are very, very few stories of gods abducting young men. There are a handful of stories where, you know, it's a little bit more of like we're supposed to think they're in love kind of thing. Apollo, you know, has a handful of boyfriends, and we're definitely meant to think like, okay, no, this is reciprocal, and we're meant to think they are of a similar age. In those cases, the men almost always die. Whereas in this case, it's particularly interesting that Ganymede does not die, that he is abducted and, yes, assaulted, absolutely horrific, by Zeus, but kept with Zeus on Mount Olympus and given this important role of cupbearer. And that's because what this is likely coming from is the practice of pederasty. I've talked about it on the podcast before. It's incredibly problematic. It is incredibly ancient as well. I forget who told me this, but I believe it was a guest who said that the earliest reference, it would have been Charlotte in the episodes we did on Achilles and Patroclus. And so apparently the oldest reference to the concept of pederasty is coming from Crete in archaic period, I believe, if not earlier. I just remember thinking, okay, it wasn't Athens, and it was a very long time ago. And so pederasty, you know, is this tradition in ancient Greece where older, more established men would develop sexual and also like mentor-style relationships with younger men. And by that, I mean, you know, legally children today. And it was a practice, you know, that was understood to be something beneficial because it really was in large part about mentorship, and in some cases, you know, what they would believe was real love. Obviously it's super problematic, but it didn't have those connotations, and it's not specific to men, right? Like, girls would have also been married off at that young an age, but the tradition between men and boys became really, really well respected. It was like an important thing in a lot of ancient Greek cultures. It was a big deal. And so Ganymede's story being one where he is brought to a better place, Olympus, where he is given, like, essentially this is meant to be like a big gift because he has become, you know, Zeus has become, I always forget if it's Erastes or Romanos, which one is the older guy and which one is the younger guy, but essentially that's the gift. Like, they are entering into this Erastes Aramenos relationship, this pederastic relationship, and so it is meant to be seen as a gift. Like, Zeus is giving Ganymede this gift of his mentorship, and it also comes with assault, sexual assault, I should be clear. But you know, even the gifts of divine horses to his father down in Troy, like, it's really all quite specific to this pederastic relationship and kind of emphasizing that cultural importance. So doesn't take away the ick, but it is relevant, and obviously it is also just like notable that it is men, you know, a boy who is given this kind of much more like good treatment. And that's because it is representing something, you know, very different from the women. And so like it is, yeah, it's very patriarchal. It's very problematic, but it is also just like an interesting examination of like where these things are coming from and like why some are grosser than others and like why they are, you know, so different. And it does all tie back to patriarchy, but in an interesting way. All right, the rest of that episode was a lot of just more of the same, unfortunately, more of just like the sort of the regional stories, right? Where, yes, they're horrifying. The volume of women that Zeus assaulted in mythology is horrifying. But, you know, when it comes to the volume of names, we are really ultimately looking at like a regional thing. We are looking at all of these different regions competing for attention in the wider Greek world, right? Like, there was no unified Greece. There were a lot of small city-states or just generally different like regional things. They often fought with each other. They were competing. And so very often you get multiple stories of gods like Zeus doing really similar things to lots of different people in different places. And again, while it does seem horrifying when we're looking at it now, back then it was really about putting your town on the map, right? Like, it's like the Heracles thing. It's why there are so many stories of Heracles from the whole of the ancient Greek world, why there are so many stories of him sleeping with women, consensually or otherwise. And that is because all of these different places wanted to almost literally put themselves on the map. So they did so by establishing stories that featured the Greek hero Heracles, because he is the one that is the hero for all of Greece, whereas the others tend to be more regionally famous. So they either, are including these Heracles stories, or Zeus, because he is the king of the gods for the whole of the ancient Greek culture. And so, having him involved with women from your region, whether the story was nice or not, was really important. And that's why we end up with so many of them. And especially when it comes to nymphs too, we're looking at the natural world. The nymphs symbolized various things in the natural world, rivers and streams and trees and the sea and all of these different things, right? And so when Zeus is with them, then we are connecting again to the natural world, often regionally, and just like through, these characters who also symbolize the earth itself, right? It's just like about it's like about a man impregnating the earth, because it's all about who's making babies and who controls the babies that are made. That was honestly so much fun. I got to remember that there are a good number of these episodes where I can really provide all this extra insight. Like, I'm trying to stick, if I do these episodes, it's not going to be that often. And it's going to be with episodes like this one, like this Zeus one, and like the Theogony one, where there is so much more that I've learned since. Just because it really does add so much. And I mean, for me and you, it's really interesting to look at what 7 years of non-stop researching ancient Greek myth can do to one's knowledge. It's fun to be self-taught. I'm a good example of just have at it if you love this stuff. Oh my god, read everything and listen to me all the time, because if you think I have not become better at this job in 7 years, then you are just not paying attention. Again, thank you all so much for listening. On Friday, we will have another reading episode, and make sure to get your questions in for this summer's Q&A episodes. Those will be coming next week. Get them in. It's Friday the 26th. Get them in by the end of the Pacific day. Ideally, mythsbaby.com/questions. And, this episode is a great, I think, prompt to ask me questions either about some of the things I've said here, or if there are other episodes that you'd like me to do this with, I would love to hear about them. I would love for you to share that. If you're listening on Spotify, I'm going to try to remember to set up a question that will prompt that exact thing, because I would love to know the episodes that you would like to have re-examined, because it's really fun for me. And also, honestly, sometimes it can make my life a lot easier because I don't have to write 6,000 words of a script, and we all still get really interesting, fun content. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians. She and I are becoming a well-oiled machine these days. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. My Patreon, it exists. I promise I'm going to try to do more with it. And as always, if you're thinking of subscribing to my Patreon, please consider it a donation to the free podcast, because there is only so many hours in the day. And so I appreciate it, but that's where we're at. Oh, I don't even know. Can I say thank you again? Sure. Thank you. You're all the best. I have such exciting stuff coming. I'm just getting so pumped. Thank you, as always, for the 8th time. I am Liv, and if you cannot tell, I still love this shit an awful lot.